All right, we have session 22 here, and we're on 1 Corinthians 14, 22, and 23 of accurately handling the word of truth. And I pray that I can accurately handle some of these things that are pretty tangled up in a lot of ways. I want to begin with a short review and then some things that I didn't get to because I was getting the hand over the throat from the technician last week. So I'm going to start out with this that I already went through, is that several people have come to me and bemoaned. They said, I just wish Paul would have used quotation marks. Why didn't he invent quotation marks if nobody else did? Because how can we be sure? And I gave some reasons why he didn't use quotation marks. He never intended this letter to be read by anybody but a handful of Christians in the first century. It was a response to what they had written to him about. So he wasn't busy saying, you told me, or you wrote to me and said, those kinds of things. There was no such thing as plagiarism in the first century. It wasn't against the law to take somebody else's ideas and not acknowledge that they had written it first. Okay? So those are some reasons, and most people said, I'm still not convinced. That doesn't do it for me. And so I want to go through some things. There's two professors that wrote a book actually called Quoting the Corinthians. Watson and Cully from prestigious universities that we would all know the names of if I mention them. They came up with 12 different clues that can tell you, even without quotation marks, even without those obvious "you said" or "I heard that you did" or something like that. They came up with 12 not so obvious clues that can tell you when he's quoting. Obvious clues are those things like quotation marks and where it's just written out someplace, this is what you said to me, this is what you wrote to me. Those are obvious clues. They said that there's 12 more less obvious clues. Most of us will say, if it's not an obvious clue, I don't want to play anymore. I'm just walking off the field. It's a boring game. I don't care about it anymore. But for those that really want to know some serious things about Paul, they came up with 12. Well, I reduced it down to 4 that make sense to me. Many of the others are way beyond my level of rhetorical skill to understand. But they came up with 4 questions that you got to ask yourself that are clues that he could be quoting. The first one is called syncretism. It's when there is a mixture of other beliefs mixed with Christian language and beliefs to create something else, to create something strange, weird out of it. And is there such a mixture in verse 21 and 22? The answer is yes. Pagan religion believed that speaking with tongues was a indicator of the presence of a God. Okay? And that's what the Corinthians said in verse 22. They said, speaking in tongues is a sign to unbelievers. A sign, and that meant a positive indicator of something real, and it was that they believed that it was just like in pagan religion, is that tongues meant that God was here. That's childish thinking, by the way. We've covered a lot of, I'll get to it. Second, is there contradictions in these two verses, verse 21 and 22? You should have your Bibles open to 21 and 22 so that you can take a look at it. Okay? Verse 21 and verse 22, is there contradictions with what it says in verse 23, the next verses? Is it inconsistent? And the answer is yes. What is written in verse 21 and verse 22 is inconsistent and is contradicted in verses 23 through 25. We haven't even got there yet, but I got to spill the beans on it because that's the order that Paul wrote stuff in. The next one is, are there refutations? Of course, that's not a word we use very much, but it means, is there an argument against something in these verses? Verse 21 and 22 say that tongues means this. And verse 23 argues against what verse 22 says. Verse 22 says tongues are a positive sign that God is here, and I'll prove that to you too as I get to it. But verse 23 says no, tongues are not an indication that God is here. That's not. It's an indication of something else entirely. But the fourth one is the one that puts the last nail in the coffin for me. It may not for you, but it puts it in. It's called the test of common sense. The test of common sense. Does reading verse 22 that says that tongues are for a sign to unbelievers, if that's a Corinthian idea that Paul is quoting, does that make the most intelligent and practical sense of the passage? Yes, it does. It does for this common sense reason. And I'll elaborate more. If Paul endorses everything that's contained in verses 21 and 22, then he has clearly contradicted himself. It's obvious that he has contradicted himself. Anybody who reads those verses with half a brain turned on will see that verse 22 contradicts verse 23. Absolutely say the opposite thing, only in different words. Okay. So the question is, all right, I'll get to that here in a second. It's common sense continued on the next page of the revised. If you've got the revised of the study guide, that's on the back table there. If you came walking in with the old study guide, you're going to get confused. Go get the one that says, it's got the frame that says Common Sense Continued. It's on the table back there. It says verse 22 revised. Verse 22 revised. For those of you that are online, don't make any difference to you. You're just going to see it up on the screen there. Here's the thing about common sense. Anyone believing, I'm just going to read this so I don't get all mixed up. Anyone believing that the ideas contained in verse 21 and verse 22 of chapter 14 originated with Paul. Paul agrees with those ideas. Paul came up with those ideas. Anyone who believes that that's Paul talking in those two verses there must convincingly explain a couple of things. It's not my responsibility to convince you that he's quoting the Corinthians. It's your responsibility to convince me why Paul obviously contradicts himself in verse 23 from verse 22. You've got to convince me why he's not contradicting himself when it is clear and obvious that he is. What does that say to you about the character and ethics of Paul? Here's another one right here. If they believe that's Paul's ideas in verse 22 there, why they got to convincingly explain why tongues are a sign to them that believe not. What in the world does that mean? I tell you what, there are smart people that have they will go to their grave believing that Paul believes that tongues are a sign for unbelievers. And they can't explain it except for one pathetic little idea that they've come up with. The explanation that has been commonly given is that tongues are a sign of God's coming judgment on unbelievers. How did they get that? Out of tongues are a sign for unbelievers. Well, they had to go back into the Old Testament and dig around. First of all, they claimed that Isaiah 28 was talking about the Assyrian invasion of Assyria on Judah. All right? Let's go back a little bit further in history. Isaiah is talking and prophesying hundreds of years later. No, that's not true. A little bit later, if he's talking about the Assyrian invasion, you got to go back to 2 Kings chapter 18 and find out what really happened. What's the rest of the story? You know what? Those scholars who believe that 1 Kings or 2 Kings 18, 26 through 28 shows that tongues are a sign of God's coming judgment on unbelievers, have to hope and pray that you never go to 1 Kings and find out what the rest of the story is. It's a contradiction because in 1 Kings, we find out that the Assyrians, instead of coming to Jerusalem and to Judah, insisting on speaking in Assyrian language, they came to Judah insisting on speaking in Hebrew. Contrary to what our scholars keep maintaining. The second thing is that guess who wanted the Assyrians to speak in Assyrian instead of in Hebrew? The Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders sent word to the emissary and to the general of the Assyrian army and says, don't talk to us in Hebrew. We don't want the people to hear what you have to say. They were the ones that insisted on speaking with strange tongues. It wasn't the Assyrians that were insisting on speaking with strange tongues. It was the Jews that were insisting upon speaking with strange tongues. It is absolutely inconsistent. You've got to prove to me why that's not inconsistent. What does that do to Paul if Paul believed all that? What kind of character does that put on Paul if Paul really believed that stuff? Common sense requires that verse 21 and verse 22 be viewed as Paul's reproduction of what the Corinthians had written to him in order to avoid some very drastic things. Here's what believing that Paul is quoting error in 21 and 22. It will avoid attributing an obvious contradiction to Paul. Suddenly, the contradiction disappears. You don't have Paul in verse 22 contradicting himself in verse 23. What you've got is the Corinthians with their strange idea, and then you've got Paul's sane and rational and realistic idea in verse 23. Now, the second thing that is avoided by believing that Paul is quoting the Corinthians is that it avoids suspecting Paul of altering Isaiah 28, 11, and 12 to fit his own purposes. How can you trust the credibility of an apostle that would mangle an Old Testament prophecy as badly as verse 22 is? How could you, what kind of character does a guy have who does that kind of stuff? You'd be thrown out of any Bible-believing church in the world today if you did that. So you've got to prove to me, if you think that verse 22 is Paul's ideas, you got to prove to me how that doesn't make Paul unethical. And then thirdly, believing he's quoting the Corinthians avoids believing that Paul does not hesitate to misquote scriptures out of context. There is no logical connection between verse 21 and verse 22. Verse 21 is a mangled quotation of Isaiah. Verse 22 comes up with some conclusions because it says the word wherefore, which means so then. Okay, and we'll get to that here in a second. So if verse 21 is Paul's idea, verse 22 is Paul's idea, then Paul is misquoting Scripture in verse 21, and he is making a conclusion that's totally out of context because there's nothing in verse 21 that brings you logically to the conclusion of verse 22. Whew! I tell you what, I needed to get that off my chest because up until this point, everybody could say, you're just making that up. You are misquoting scriptures for your own purposes. No, I'm not. Common sense requires, if you don't take that, then Paul's a fake, Paul's a sham, and Paul has loose ethics and morals. Wow. That's where I'm at. So now we're going to get to the very words. Let's go on to the next one here. Wherefore, and so. That's what it means. And so. Isaiah says, we're talking about verse 22 now. Starting in, are we there yet? Yeah. Wherefore, and so, because Isaiah said what's said in verse 21, and so we say, the Corinthians are saying, and so we say, verse 22, tongues are for a sign for unbelievers. They got nothing to stand on for that assertion at all. There's no logical connection between 21 and 22. You can't find logic between those two, even though they imply that there's logic. That it's just like falling off a log to conclude this. It's not. Based on what Isaiah has claimed, I'm not going to go any further into that. Time is ticking away here. Let's go on to something more important here on tongues are for a sign. Look at the word for. You say, it's just a 3-letter word. Why do you want to use up time on a 3-letter word in there? Because this is a rail switch word right here. It's just one little word. Why make a big deal out of it? It's because a little tiny rail switch in a railroad system moves massive tonnage in a certain direction. This little word here moves massive doctrine, one direction or another. The word for in Greek here means to the intent. Tongues are to the intent. Tongues are intended to be a sign. Tongues are intended to be a sign to unbelievers. The Corinthians thought that the intended purpose of speaking with tongues was to be a sign of something. And actually, we'll get to it here in just a second. The problem is with this is that the Corinthians said that tongues are intended as a sign. But Paul has already in chapter 14 told us what tongues are intended for. Actually, it starts in chapter 12 where he starts talking about what tongues are intended for. Here's 3 things that tongues are intended for according to Paul. Go to verse 2 of chapter 14. Tongues are prayer to God. Tongues are intended to be prayer toward God. That means supplication, intercession, and giving of thanks, according to the Thessalonians, right? Tongues are intended to be supplication, giving of thanks, and intercession toward God. Is that what the Corinthians say? Is that what verse 22 says? It's another contradiction. Look out for contradictions. Number 2, go to verse 4 and you'll find out that tongues are to edify the individual. He that speaketh in an unknown tongue edifies himself. My argument there is, how could you possibly edify the church if you're not first edified yourself? It's not selfish to edify yourself by speaking in tongues. It is loving the church to speak in tongues to edify yourself. It feeds the church. Number 3, you go to verse 12 and 13, you find out that it edifies. You actually can go to verse 5 too, because it says that prophecy edifies the church, except if tongues is interpreted, that edifies the church as well. So you could go verse 5, verse 12, and verse 13, all say that tongues are for the intent of edifying the church. That's been explained many times. Where does that fit in with verse 22 where it says, that's not the intent of tongues? We got the answer for what tongues are intended for. And guess what they did? They borrowed a page right out of their pagan upbringing. And they didn't even modify it very much. They put a little Christianese in there by quoting Isaiah in a wacky way. But they took a page right out of pagan worship and stuck it into the middle of Christian Doctrine and practice. No wonder Paul couldn't let it rest. Devoted 3 chapters to the whole thing. He was fired up. So am I. So, they say it's intended to be a sign. Paul says it's intended to be prayer, edification of the individual, and edification of the church. It's all in that chapter right there. Sign. Let's take a look at that word, sign. It's a big one. Sign, you can't just go to your elementary school dictionary and look under sign. You got to go to theological dictionaries of the New Testament in Greek. Otherwise, you're going to get led astray in that. What is a sign? It is an indicator and proof of authenticity. Okay, even today, if you look at our street signs out here, basically those signs are an indicator of the authenticity of where you are in relation to everything else. It's an indicator and proof of authenticity. And that's what it was. That's what it was meant by the Corinthians, that they said that speaking in tongues will show that we're genuine. Speaking in tongues will show we're the real thing. We're authentic. We've got the real stuff. Now, here's what a sign was in pagan worship. It was an undeniable evidence that the tongue speaker was under the influence, and I put possessed, you could put carried away. Paul uses the word in chapter 12, verse 2, carried away by these idols, which he already told us that these idols means demons. In chapters 8 and 10, there he said, carried away with these demons, or as the Greeks would say, carried away by the gods. Carried away by gods. A whole bunch of them, not tons of them along the way. But they were carried away by the gods, and that was a genuine proof that they were in the presence of the divine along the way. It proved to unbelievers, skeptics, those who didn't believe, it proved to them that it's real. It's the real thing. Tongues is the real thing. Proves that God is real. The gods are real. It says it's a sign not to them that believe. All right? The word believe actually is literally the persuaded ones. Them that believe is the persuaded ones. Corinthians believed, believers, or what the Corinthians considered to be believers, that those that were fully persuaded that tongues was a sign to unbelievers. They were fully persuaded that tongues were a sign for unbelievers. They felt that the more you spoke in tongues out loud, the more demonstrative that could be, the more it would persuade the unbelievers that God was really present. So tongues didn't have to be a sign for the persuaded ones. Tongues had to be an undeniable sign to those that weren't persuaded yet. Okay? It was to persuade the unpersuaded. Sounds like our evangelistic crusade sometimes, right? But to them that believe not, literally the unpersuaded ones. Speaking in tongues was to be the undeniable evidence that God's presence, and it would persuade the unpersuaded. That's pretty immature thinking. That's pretty shallow thinking that says that my unintelligible sound making is going to convince and persuade the skeptics that God is real. And we say, oh, come on, that's just so pathetic. That reasoning is wacky. Why would anybody believe that? Paul started out in verse 20 by saying, brethren, and he was talking about these Corinthians, brethren, stop your childish thinking. And this is an example of their childish thinking. This, in fact, is the example of their childish thinking. They had other areas they were childish in their thinking too. Just read the rest of the letter. You'll find they're childish in all kinds of ways. But this is the one he's picking on in chapter 14. This one is that tongues is going to convert skeptics that God is real. Just like tongues convinced the skeptics gods were present in the pagan temples. Hallelujah. Let's see if we can go on here. Now we get to the second part of verse 22, which is the second thing that is claimed. Tongues, the intended purpose of tongues is to persuade unbelievers. But here's the second part. But prophesying serveth not for them that believe not. Look at all the double negatives there. But anyway, what he's saying is prophecy does not benefit or does not serve unbelievers. Does not serve unbelievers. There's no mention of prophecy anywhere in their Isaiah 28 quotation or 1 Corinthians 14:21. You can look at both passages that they're drawing on here, especially the Isaiah one. There's no mention of prophesying anywhere, and yet they have come to a conclusion about prophesying anyway, with no scriptural support whatsoever. There's nothing in Isaiah or Corinthians in this section about prophesying. But we're supposed to believe that they have authority and support for this statement that prophesying doesn't benefit or serve unbelievers. You're just supposed to believe that. Out of the thin air. Anything that's said about prophesying in this verse is simply an invention of the Corinthians without any support whatsoever. There's nothing there. Doesn't that smell a little bit? Again, we're talking about what do we believe about Paul's character and ethics if he believes that stuff? You got to prove to me that Paul isn't bending or even breaking the rules by saying that right there. And if he has no problem doing that, why can we trust most of the New Testament? Apparently, the Corinthians considered unbelievers to be too unspiritual and inferior to comprehend and benefit from the deep revelations, mysteries, and knowledge that they thought they were getting when they prophesied. There was no saying, "The Lord impressed on my mind to tell you." No, it was it was an Old Testament thundering from the top of the mountain type of thing that was going on, and you were just supposed to accept it. And if you couldn't accept it, that simply meant you were too unspiritual and inferior to comprehend what was being said. That's still around today. There's a peer pressure within many of our churches that says what's thundered from the pulpit, if you don't accept it, if you're not persuaded by it, if you're skeptical of it, that means you're just inferior and you are not spiritual enough to comprehend what the deep things that were said here. This is peer pressure at its height. This pronouncement that prophecy is not for unbelievers is in direct contradiction to what is said in verse 24 and 25. Did you ever notice that this is a direct contradiction? It is a bald-faced inconsistency. Again, if Paul believes all this stuff, if Paul generated this stuff, if Paul endorses these things, how can we possibly rely on him? Man, you say, Gary, you are treading on sacred things when you question Paul. Well, I question real as opposed to fiction. This statement is also a contradiction of verse 3, 14:3, which states, "He that prophesieth speaketh unto men." Corinthians said, he that prophesies doesn't speak to all men, only the superior spiritual men. That's the only ones that he that prophesies speaks to. Paul, which I do think he endorses verse 3, says that he that prophesies speaks unto men. Men means mankind, all of them. Whether they are believers or unbelievers makes no difference whatsoever. When you prophesy, it is for people. And they're saying, no, most people are the unwashed masses. They can never understand this stuff. I don't understand it, but I think it's just error. All right, but for them that believe. My, that good old clock is just staring me down right here. For them who believe, prophesying is only for believers. That's what they're saying here. It's only for the persuaded ones. In other words, the ones who are totally persuaded that they're superior, and it could, and it's only for them. But this is a direct, is argued against and refuted in verse 24 and 25, where it says that prophecy, where Paul deliberately emphasizes that unbelievers are the ones that receive the most benefit from prophesying. Verse 22 says, unbelievers can't receive benefit from prophesying. Verse 24 says unbelievers are the ones that benefit the most. Who are you going to believe? They cannot be both true. Again, if we believe that Paul is quoting the Corinthians in verse 22, then that takes away the suspicion that Paul contradicts himself and is okay with it. He's not okay with contradictions. He doesn't contradict himself. But these verses, taken the way most of the world takes them, you've got Paul contradicting himself right here. Paul considered preaching Christ to unbelievers to be the highest form of prophesying, even though the Corinthians thought that it was foolishness. Don't preach, don't prophesy to unbelievers. That's just foolishness. Look at chapter 1, verse 22, where it says, we preach Christ crucified to the Greeks, and guess who the church in Corinth was made up of? Greeks. They, without the regenerated work of God in their lives, were of the opinion, don't preach Christ to the unbelievers. It's foolishness to even try. You're a fool to preach to unbelievers. And yet, verse 24 and 25 absolutely argue against that and say, it is the wisdom of God to preach, to prophesy, to exhort, to do all the things, to share one-on-one, all the things that prophecy actually means, where God's put something on my heart to report to you. Real prophecy can easily be understood by believers or unbelievers, unlearned, and believers, the three people groups that are mentioned in there. It benefits them all. All right. Now, now we're going to go to verse 23 for 15 minutes. Didn't get, there it is, verse 23, but no, 23. Pause for station identification. Well, Stacy is looking around to see if she can convince that bunch of wire and plastic over there to do what I would like it to do. I'm just going to read it. Verse 23 says, if therefore the whole church be come together into one place, and all speak with tongues, and there come in those that are unlearned and unbelievers, will they not say that ye are mad? Now this is, most people in the churches, they may not know anything at all about speaking in tongues, at all, but this is one phrase that they all know. They may not have ever heard any teaching on speaking in tongues, but this is one phrase that they all have heard and fear. The phrase is, will they not say ye are mad? And that phrase is connected to speaking in tongues. Therefore, never speak in tongues. All right. I intend to kind of dismantle that along the way, and I think we're going to do it without the PowerPoint. Yeah, okay. I threw Stacy a curveball, and it certainly it was. And that was actually, it's my fault. First thing I want to point out about this verse is, does anybody notice that this whole verse is a question? You got to look in your Bibles to see this one here. It's got a question mark at the end. Of course, Greek has no question marks either. So you have to look for other clues to find out whether this is a question or a statement. So we go to the first two words at the beginning of the sentence. The words there are if therefore. And if therefore, let's see, I've got it written down here to make sure I don't say this wrong. If therefore means if, when, okay, here it is. So what if then is what, if you looked at the Greek word for if, therefore, what you would find in most reliable Greek dictionaries is that it says, so what if then? Or so if then. But there's a what in wherefore as well. So it's so what if then. So that's how the sentence begins. Just finished quoting all the things that the Corinthians believe about speaking in tongues and prophecy. Now Paul is coming back with a question of his own. This is what you call cross-examination in any court, because 1 Corinthians is not a fatherly letter of advice. It's a court of argument, back and forth. You think this, you do this, you want this, you eat this, you do that. What about that? And he's cross-examining them here. You think tongues are for a positive sign that God is in your midst, and it's enough to blow you away and convert you. So what if then? He's saying, okay, so you think it's going to be a positive sign to unbelievers? So what if then? And he proceeds to lay out a hypothetical illustration, situation. Scenario is another word that's used for that. He's laying out a what if then. See? Now, some say that this is purely hypothetical and it never happened. I tend to want to propose that this scenario actually happened sometimes in the Corinthian church. This whole scenario that he describes here actually happened. Why do I think that? Because he got reports from those that were there. They came and visited him and they said, you know what's going on in Corinth? I think that this really happened, but regardless of whether it's hypothetical or real, the question is, what if this happens? Are they going to be blown away by the impressiveness of your speaking in tongues, convinced that God is here, and be converted? Or is something else going to realistically happen? And this is the point that we're at right now. the first part is, the first hint is, so what if then, is what the literal meaning is. And then at the end, in the last phrase, will they not? In other words, aren't they going to conclude something different than you thought they would? Will they not? In other words, you tell me what's real and what's childish. Oops, I got to put that down. Kids and their toys. Okay, so wherefore the whole church be come together in one place. I don't know why Paul spends so many words to convince you that we're talking about a large gathering. We're talking about big. We're not talking about little Mount Zion here. We're not talking about little branches of the big tree. We're talking about, like, for example, all the house churches and all the small group fellowships and all the groups that meet in the back room of the tannery and all the small groups that meet on the shipping decks at lunchtime and things like that. He's talking about them all coming together in one place. We're talking something that's large, which raises the question, can we all speak in tongues together in small groups? And I'm not going to try to answer that one right now. I just thought I'd kick that hornet and run. Kick that hornet's nest and run. So anyway, they're all in one place. Okay, there we go. And there come in those that are unlearned. Now, who are these unlearned and unbelievers who come in? Who are these guys? Who are these girls who come in? The first category is unlearned. They are not the same people. They're not the same kind. Those that are unlearned, here's what unlearned means in Greek. One who is unacquainted. One who is inexperienced. One who is an outsider. That's what those that are unlearned means in Greek. That puts a different light on it, because the common knowledge is that the unlearned are idiots. They're just idiots. They don't know. They don't. And then another common interpretation of the learned is they don't understand speaking in tongues. Well, newsflash to all of you mighty scholars out there: nobody understands speaking in tongues. Hello? So every single Christian in the world is unlearned, and every unbeliever in the world is unlearned too, because no one understands speaking in tongues. So forget that definition that you find in some of the commentaries along the way. It's inconsistent. But if you are unacquainted, that doesn't mean you are totally unacquainted with Christianity. That doesn't mean that you are inexperienced in the things of God. It doesn't mean you're an outsider to the whole church. What it means is that you are unacquainted with the way they do things in any given location where the body of Christ meets. See, if you're unacquainted what a large group of Christians are going to do together, then you're unacquainted You're unlearned. You just aren't acquainted with it. You just happen to be there. Either you're the spouse of a Christian who came, or a child of a Christian who came, or you just came because, hey, there was entertainment here. There's something big going on. Or whatever reason brings them that are not acquainted with the church culture. I'm using that word here. They're simply not acquainted with the way things are done and the reason why things are done this way in this particular gathering. Not in the church universal, not in the church in every town. The way church is run in this location, in this city, in this place, right here. If they don't attend regularly, guess what they are? Outsiders. They're not insiders, they're outsiders. That doesn't mean that they're not Christians. It means they just don't go there. They go someplace else. Are there outsiders that drop in here? Yeah. Are they non-Christians? We can take for granted they're non-Christians, or they're idiots, or they just wandered in high on drugs or something like that. No, they're just from someplace else, and they happen to be here, and they're unacquainted with the way we do things. I think a lot of times the church does not explain why they do things the way they do enough, and it causes outsiders much confusion. And you'll see that that's exactly what happens in Paul's scenario here. So unacquainted, outsiders, inexperienced, if they haven't been in your meetings very often or ever, they're not going to be experienced. They're inexperienced. They're just they're receiving their first impression of what church is like. Your church is like. Not all the church is like, but your church. They're getting their first impression of it. How many know that first impressions are powerful and they stay with you? You can be all kinds of other reasons, excuses, facts, and logic can be thrown at them, and their first impression still withstands it all. That's what an unlearned person is, right there. Watch out for how we treat unlearned persons. We take for granted everybody knows why we do what we do. No. It's even people here that are not inexperienced, that have been here a while, that still don't know why we do what we do. Okay, that's on me as much as it's on everybody else. Okay, so the unlearned come in, the unbelievers come in. I don't know. There isn't much information given about unbelievers other than I asked some questions. Are they stubbornly unbelieving? Or are they ignorantly unbelieving? There's a big difference. There's a whole different critter in a stubbornly unbelieving than there is in an ignorantly unbelieving. We all pigeonhole right away. And then we have the next one are they unpersuaded about the entire gospel? Are they unpersuaded about Christ? Are they unpersuaded about that is there really a God? I don't believe there is, and I'm setting out to prove there isn't. They're unpersuaded about everything about eternal and invisible things. They're the hardcore materialists. Or are they unpersuaded about a certain aspect of a Christian doctrine? That whole spectrum can be an unbeliever. We write unbelievers off. Do not do it. Okay, I write unbelievers off. Yeah. I'm going to leave it there because the next phrase, will they not say, is a proof, an unobvious clue that Paul is asking a question instead of making a statement. So I'm going to stop right there and continue on. Next time, the big old face at the back of the room is saying, "You're done, man." And so that's where we'll start off next time in verse 23. Will